My name is Nitin Sahani. I'm a research fellow and lecturer in the MIT program in Art, Culture, and Technology. I'm really glad to see all of you here for Ricardo's talk today. This program is part of the ACT lecture series, the Art, Culture, Technology lecture series, which is curated by Utamita Bauer. She's unable to join us just yet. She's just getting off of a plane from Europe, I'm told, and will be here shortly. So I'll be moderating on her behalf, but I hope she'll be with us soon. The lecture series is called Collision 2, where artists, artistic and scientific research meet. Our intent is to bring together artists and scientists from different disciplines to discuss their methodologies and forms of inquiry at the intersection of art, architecture, science, and technology. The series is part of what we're calling AR, Artistic Research, a year-long collaboration between ACT and the Simmons Foundation in Munich. Again, is curated by Utamita Bauer and the Simmons curator of the visual arts, Thomas Trummer. The artistic research program will be on view at the Media Lab complex throughout the next couple of weeks. And I have to be sure to announce that as part of this program, this collaboration, there will be a reception held next week on April 4th at 5:30 p.m. in the Media Lab lobby at MIT, just next door to us, in the presence of the curators and artists Attila Sergo, is that correct, Laura? And Yuri Kepesh, whose daughter will be with us, Juliet Stone-Kepesh. The reception will be followed by a lecture by Attila called Turning Out the Space, with Thomas Trummer as respondent, who's curating this program with us. Now, I should also mention that this program juxtaposes works by Hungarian artist Attila, really exhibited photograms and Polaroids by Yuri Kepesh, who founded the CAVS in 1967, as well as other artists who've been part of this project, including J.Rim Lee, whose work, Burial Project, has been discussed in our lecture series last time, and by the Argentinian artists Guillermo and Nicholas Goldberg, who work on meteorites, which I moderated a few weeks ago. So it's a fascinating collision of artistic practice and scientific research, which we're sort of hoping to bring to an end in our last lecture series next week. But for today, I'm very proud and very fortunate to have Ricardo Dominguez here. I've been trying to bring Ricardo on campus for nearly a year, first to speak in my class last semester, which he eventually did via Skype, and then finally we're happy to have him here for this public talk, and he'll be speaking with my class tomorrow. Ricardo is a co-founder of the Electronic Disturbance Theater, a group that's been involved in what he calls virtual sit-in technologies since 1998 in solidarity with the Zapatista communities in Chiapas, Mexico. He's the co-director of b.a.n.g, an internet service provider for artists and activists. His recent work, the Electronic Disturbance Theater, was done in conjunction with a number of artists, including Brett Stonbaum, Misha Cardenas, and Amy Carroll. Their centerpiece was a tool that they called the Transborder Immigrant Tool, a GPS-based cell phone safety net tool, as Ricardo likes to call it, for crossing the border between the US and Mexico. This project was the winner of the Transnational Communities Award, funded by the Cultural Contact Endowment for Culture in Mexico and the US. It's also been funded by Cal-IT too, and a number of humanities programs based at the UCSD, where Ricardo is currently a tenured professor. And it's been exhibited at a number of biennials, including the San Diego Museum of Contemporary Art, and in Spain and El Salvador. Now, Ricardo will be speaking in a two-part program, and as part of this, we've also asked Chris Csikszentmihalyi to come and be a respondent for this. Chris is here. He will join us at the table shortly to sort of bring some critical questions of inquiry on Ricardo's work. Chris is very intimately familiar with Ricardo's work and will sort of pose a number of questions in both parts of the talk. Chris directs the Center for Future Civic Media at MIT and also the Computing Culture Group at the MIT Media Lab. He joined our faculty in 2001 and has been doing his research for a number of years in sort of the intersection of civic media and contested spaces. He's been developing a number of political technologies of relevance to citizenship, corporations, and government. And he's trained as an artist, working at the intersection of new technology, media, information activism, and the arts for the past 16 years or so. In 2005, Chris was a Rockefeller New Media Fellow, and in 2007, he received a fellowship with the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard, where he conducted some of his work on robotics, which I won't get into. He's also served as a part of the delegation by the US State Department, exploring tools to strengthen civil society in the face of narco-trafficking violence in the Mexico-US border. So there's a lot of intersections between Chris's work and that of Ricardo's, which I hope will come about in the Respondent discussion shortly after. So with that, let me turn the floor to Ricardo, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us today.
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias a todas las comunidades que me han invitado. Es una cosa fantástica para mí. Thank you so much to all the communities that have invited me here this evening. It's really quite fantastic to be here among old and new friends, or old and new friends, depending on which side of the code you reside. What I wanted to do was basically divide the story of the work that we've been doing at Cal IT2, which is an edge technology institute that was initiated in 2005. First, I'll focus on electronic civil disobedience, where it emerged, how it emerged, and what kind of questions were swirling around that emergence. Then look at some of the practice that came out of that concept. Then I'll have a discussion around electronic civil disobedience. Then the second part, I'll focus on the Transborder Immigrant Tool and some of the elements that bridge into that gesture, and perhaps some differences that play themselves out. I'll try to mobilize a bit between just reading and speaking. I always like to begin at the beginning, or even before the beginning, and as a part of a way to conceptualize a question that is often asked of artists or other human beings: how did this project start? What were impulses, certain situations? Well, when I was born in 1959, my father gave me an RCA black and white portable television, probably weighed more than MIT altogether. And it was a brilliant, beautiful present just for being born, and he put it in my crib. And I found that glass warmth, that ectoplasmic tube, to be even more intimate for me than perhaps the people around me in my life. I loved coloring on the Flintstones, on political situations that were emerging on that screen. But what drew me to that RCA were the tubes. You would turn them on, they would heat up, they would glow. Well, around 2.5 or close to 3, my mother gave me some lovely leche de mamá, warm mother's milk. And I thought to myself, at least I imagine, what would happen if you were to pour some more mother's milk on this RCA portable black and white television? An interesting encounter, perhaps, over two objects of love and desire, sustenance. Well, what happened was, pow! Destruction, fire, mother screaming, father yelling. So that's really what the work continually does. Encountering ubiquitous technologies and then taking the simplest kind of artifact like warm mother's milk to disturb its conditions and to bring together communities that then begin to ask, how did it happen? Why did it happen? Why did you do such a thing? So electronic civil disobedience for me is a continuation of that sort of warm mother's milk. And I recommend that anytime you have to deal with any large-scale efforts. If you want to disturb them, milk is always a good thing. Electronic Civil Disobedience, Inventing the Future of Online Agitprop Theater. We see that a certain revolutionary type is not possible. But at the same time, we comprehend that another revolutionary type becomes possible, not through a certain form of class struggle, but rather through a molecular revolution, which not only sets in motion social classes and individuals, but also a machinic and semiotic revolution, Felix Guattari. We follow the speed of dreams, Subcomandante Insurgente Marcos, the speed of dreams. Critical Art Ensemble staged the theory of electronic civil disobedience, ECD, as a gamble against a form of all too present future of dead capital, otherwise known as late capital. There's CAE, Critical Art Ensemble, circa 1986, I think. In our book, in the 1994 book, The Electronic Disturbance, Critical Art Ensemble argued that dead capital was being constituted as an electronic commodity form in constant flow. Capital had been, was, and would continue to be reassembling itself as a contemporary elite moved from centralized urban areas to decentralized and deterritorialized cyberspace. For Critical Art Ensemble, it was clear that cyberspace, as it was called then, was the next stage of struggle. The activist reply to this change was to teleport the system of trespass and blockage that was historically anchored to civil disobedience, a la Henry David Thoreau on civil disobedience from 1848, to this new phase of economic flows in the age of networks. As in civil disobedience, primary tactics of electronic civil disobedience are trespass and blockage. Exits, entrances, conduits, and other key spaces must be occupied by contestational force in order to bring pressure on legitimized institutions engaged in unethical or criminal actions. As we imagined in the early 90s, electronic disturbance was the core gesture that could initiate a new performative matrix. One of the elements that allowed the matrix to emerge was not only a theorization of what it might be, but a series of templates or imaginaries that allowed us to come to this question of electronic civil disobedience, which really starts around 1981 with a really horrible film. One of the things that I promote is watching really terrible films if you want to really develop your work properly. And one of these films was Tron, circa 1981. A truly horrible film, but full of resonant textures, master-slave biosystems. One could internalize and process and participate in a resistant culture. This was very evocative to us at that point. Another really terrible film emerged in 1982 called War Games, where a young freaker freaks into a series of lines, gets into NORAD, starts World War III, or it's imagined. So freaking, getting into lines or signals that one shouldn't be dialing or calling, right? War dialing, perhaps. 3, not a bad film, but certainly not well liked at that particular period of time, Blade Runner. There it offered a recombinant culture. So there we had a kind of a triptych where we could imagine the emergence of, in the not too near future, of virtual capitalism, of ways to access the paradigms of virtual capitalism, the emergence of biocapitalism, or what we called clone capitalism in recombinant culture. And then it was really brought together by a book called Neuromancer by William Gibson, in which he defined on his typewriter up in Canada the term cyberspace. Now, the way he defined cyberspace was really important for us in that he defined it not as hardware, not as software, not as telephony, but as a mass consensual hallucination. Now, those elements, I think, allowed us to begin to imagine what we could bring together as a type of performative matrix that would allow a group in Tallahassee, Florida, without computers, to begin to imagine interfacing in a contestational way with emerging cycles of capitalism to come. So one of the unique elements of trying to think at the level of speed of dreams was utopian plagiarism. That is, we decided that usually individuals, artists, thinkers sit around for the muse of fire to ascend the brightest heaven of invention, and that we were really waiting for that. So with utopian plagiarism, what we would do is take fabulous books by Cixous, Adorno, anything we could get our hands on, and just change terms. So for instance, you're reading Adorno on negative dialectics. Every time he says negative dialectics, you say electronic disturbance. You have a whole chapter, perhaps a whole book on this. One of the books I was reading was on civil disobedience by Thoreau. And we just put electronic in front of civil disobedience. Suddenly Thoreau was speaking of electronic civil disobedience. So we didn't actually have to know what it was, but it was emerging through utopian plagiarism. So we recommend this as the proper process to really get things moving quickly. And part of this landscape then was to assemble not only a theory of electronic civil disobedience, but to begin to define the components. The performative matrix would be a battle, as in Tron, between real bodies and data bodies. And the values of virtual capitalism would have to be defined as to on what side of that binary would it fall, real bodies or data bodies. So, for instance, we would come up with gestures, performances, and you can do this at home. Go into a bank without any credit cards or any identification, perhaps a letter from your mother, and say, hello, I'm Ricardo Dominguez. I'm a good person, a kind person. I need $1,000. Could you give me $1,000? And what they'll ask you is, well, what is your social security number? What is your credit card? Suddenly you'll find that it is your data body that is the value of authenticity, of truth in indicating your value. Another test that we did was we had two transgender friends who were extremely beautiful transgenders. And they had a beautiful pink Cadillac. Now, one of the rights of men in Tallahassee, Florida in the 80s was to drive on a Sunday shirtless, right? That's a right of men. Nobody can stop you to doing that. These transgenders, women, kept their identities as men. That is, their license were men. So they had the full rights to drive around in their convertible pink Cadillac without a top, right? On a Sunday afternoon in Tallahassee, this caused a certain friction, a certain kind of movement and flow. The police stopped them, and we were wondering as we filmed, would the police obey the real body in front of them or the data body? Who do you think won? What's that? Data body. Raise your hand, data body. Raise your hand, real body. Data body. Data body in the 80s always wins, right? So that is, then electronic civil disobedience had to focus in disturbing the data body, right? It was gathering an anonymous cell of technologically driven individuals, whether we call them hackers or crackers or what have you. It would be a cell that would define what areas of virtual capitalism to disturb, since the flows of capital would be at that particular site. This had to be a group that was encrypted, secretive, anonymous, kind of carrying a certain history of hacking as it was imagined in the 80s. But of course, one of the elements, this is just performances in which I was disturbing different areas of Florida at this particular time. It was a very simple performance in which I just played with toys in different public spaces. I never said anything, but police would come and get very angry. You're not supposed to play with Burger King crowns in a public sidewalk. And you can see the police ladies there. That's Daytona Beach. And you can drive cars on Daytona Beach, but you cannot play with toy cars on the beach. So this, again, was a part of a disturbance. How does one disturb different spaces? So imagine then electronic civil disobedience, for me, moving not towards this anonymous group of technologically savvy individuals, but more a man with a Burger King hat playing with toys, disturbing the condition of power. What would power do at that particular sector? Of course, we didn't have the technology at hand. We didn't have computers to actually do it. I was able then to meet a series of artists in New York City starting in 1990 and 91. Wolfgang Staehler, a visual artist from Germany, started Thing.net, which was an ISP. We used to have little modems. And you could dial on. And one of the things about Wolfgang was that he was very bored with everything. Nothing energized Wolfgang. And so I said, I'm going to do electronic civil disobedience. He goes, yeah, it sounds boring. So boredom and being left alone was a perfect place for me, in that I could teach myself what this infrastructure was. In those days, it was BBS, right, or MOO that we were participating in. One of the things that I read was an essay that came online at that time by Ronfeld and Aquila from the RAND Corporation, 1991, called Cyber War is Coming. And they defined cyber war as coming from basically first world, China, US, Europe, Israel. It would have three components. A strong infrastructure, right, telephony, computers. You would have syntactical knowledge. That is, you would have a community who had the knowledge to create software code that would drive the infrastructure. And you also had semantic knowledge. That is, a general universal use of English to communicate the infrastructure and syntactical aspect. And so I thought that was an interesting performative matrix, this cyber war, cyber terrorism, cyber crime, as they were defining it. But I felt they had left electronic civil disobedience out. And so between 91 and 94, I began to try to establish what would be the counter to that cyber war, cyber terrorism, cyber crime. Again, with imagining that it would be not a secret code community, but an individual playing with toys. I discovered that it was the conditions of the performative matrix that emerged not out of the first world, but out of Chiapas, Mexico, 1 minute after midnight. The Zapatistas emerged in contestation to NAFTA, the free trade agreement, the first kind of major neoliberal volley between Canada, the US, and Mexico. And the amazing thing about the Zapatistas was they didn't have infrastructure, right? They didn't even have telephones. They didn't have computers. Syntactical knowledge. They didn't have software. They didn't have code. Semantics. It was about 27 different Mayan communities. We call them Maya, but this Tocholabal different. They didn't even speak Spanish as their predominant language. Yet, within a few hours of 1 minute after midnight, they ripped into the electronic fabric. The New York Times called them the first postmodern revolution. And the RAND Corporation, Ronfeld and Aquila, went a bit insane. It was never part of their diagram that this should happen, right? And what was even stranger was that their process of communication was not of the communique as traditional among early versions of Maoist Leninist, coming down from the mountains, armed, ready to kill, ready to die. They improvised in this new electronic fabric, and it was around the poetic. They discovered that the poetic of the intergalactic was a powerful force for them. So I quickly began to imagine that digital zapatismo was the turnkey solution to amplifying what electronic civil disobedience would be. Very quickly, I started developing groups around this notion of electronic civil disobedience. I was contacted early on by the Anonymous Digital Coalition in '95. They were an Italian group. I didn't speak Italian, but there was a lot of people communicating at that time. Remember 1994, Mozilla, Mosaic, the first browser, had come along, right? HTML conceptualism was just bursting forth. NAFTA, the Zapatistas, so all these kind of things began to aggregate there in &94. And so by '95, Anonymous Digital Coalition said, "Ciao, Ricardo, bello, como stai?" And they were sending all these things, and I couldn't understand what they were saying. And they were basically saying, well, you know, have you noticed that in this Mosaic browser, there is what is called a refresh reload button. What if we take your idea of electronic civil disobedience and we go to the Mexican government website and all together between 1 and 3 p.m. Mexico City time, hit the reload button over and over and over and over. And that will be electronic civil disobedience. I said, fantastico, let's do that. I sent it out via email. I then received an email from Brett Stahlbaum, an artist I've worked with for a very long time now at UCSD. Said, Ricardo, you know, I don't want to hurt my finger. And I really, can we just create a little applet that will count how many people come, and that will hit the reload refresh button. But I hate HTML, I hate browsers. And so Carmen Karasik, another artist here in Boston, she was a bug hunter as her job, created the frame of HTML. And so I'm going to show you a virtual sit-in as it now functions. It's 4 HTML pages. It's still being used. Here's 2006. This was an action by the Sirens of Solidarity. They invited me to work with them to do an action against Iran for their attacks on feminist women, arrest over journal. So what happens is that you log in, enter action. It says you're going to do an action. Be aware, it's a virtual sit-in. People know where your IP is, all of that. And then you go in, and you can change the speed dial-up. We're artists, so we're interested in strange things. 404 files not found, are part of the aesthetic structure of the browser. So we would upload questions to the Mexican government. Is democracy found here? Mexican government would say, democracy is not found on this website. Here in Iran, is freedom? Freedom is not found. So these are not illegal questions that are happening, this reload function. Reloading and 404 files were our process of elucidating some of the aesthetic questions. The other element that we developed along the way was that we decided to be transparent, that we would not hide who we were. We would always tell the government where we lived, our telephone numbers, our email, our social security number. Nothing would be hidden because data bodies and real bodies had to be connected. That was the shift in digital zapatismo. Unlike electronic civil disobedience as defined by Critical Art Ensemble, we would not be hidden. That is, we would be in a Gandhian moment together. This created a performance that lasted a year, 1998. The Department of Defense got very angry when we did an action against them for selling helicopters to the Mexican army against the Zapatistas. And they said this on the front page of the New York Times. If the Electronic Disturbance Theater wasn't illegal, it was certainly immoral. The most striking thing about the Electronic Disturbance Theater is its potential as an unheard writing machine. It literally dispatches from the future. So I'll end it here in a moment. I'll just show you a video that will kind of bring all of these things together. If you can bring the sound up on the video.
Keeping these actors out.
That's Aquila from the Ronfeld.
The notion of freedom of movement in cyberspace is very closely related to the physical freedom of movement. Why in the world would we want to create a fence around a meeting in which the future of 2 continents was being decided? If indeed we're going to leave no one behind, why would we shut people out?
Take one roll down, put up another one.
Because even as they succeed in physically keeping these actors out, they are losing the battle of the story. The more they succeed, the more they lose.
It was in the hills of Chiapas in 1994. First shots were fired in the information war. Despite being without phones or electricity, Mexico's Zapatista rebels took the revolution online, issuing a call to arms across the internet for others to join them in a worldwide struggle against economic imperialism. Ricardo Dominguez and his Electronic Disturbance Theater were among the first to heed the call.
came to New York in 1991, what I was looking for was a platform that would allow me to create a space for electronic civil disobedience.
Ricardo Dominguez, Electronic Disturbance Theater, New York. Digital Zapatista.
Electronic civil disobedience is non-violent direct action online. It follows the theory of Thoreau on civil disobedience that was then developed by Gandhi, Martin Luther King, ACT UP during the 80s, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. We never destroy a server. We never change anybody's web page. We never hijack their name or domain name.
In 1998, Electronic Disturbance Theater releases FloodNet, the first automated virtual sit-in software with actions against the Mexican president's website, several Mexican banks, Frankfurt Stock Exchange, and even tries attacking the Pentagon. At one point, the Pentagon fires back with hostile Java applets, crashing the attacker's system.
By creating the idea of electronic disturbance, Ricardo found a way to mix his passion for politics and performance with a dash of magic realism and turn it into code.
Really, what is a Zapatista is those who can take into their heart the poetic gestures. The gestures of information war, which cross the boundaries of what is. For instance, on January 3rd, 2000, newspapers around the world had Zapatista Air Force attacks Mexican military. Nobody knew the Zapatistas even had planes. Nobody even knew the Zapatistas could fly. But if you read the story, suddenly you discover that these Zapatista Air Force were paper airplanes made of many different colors. Inside were messages of peace. So what the soldiers were shooting at were these paper airplanes. And there you have this enactment of a simulation, of a gesture which creates this magical space where indeed there does exist a Zapatista Air Force. Because what you're trying to get out is what the Zapatistas say is information war. That is, words as war, not words for war.
Inspired by the Zapatistas' ideas, Ricardo and his crew launched their FloodNet tool as the paper aeroplane of cyberspace.
One of the outcomes of that was that electronic civil disobedience by 1999 became international hacktivism. We released the code 1 minute after midnight, beginning of 1998. 20 minutes after we released the code, Queer Nation in San Francisco did a virtual sit-in against GodHatesFags.com. 2 weeks later, International Animal Liberation Army did a virtual sit-in against Swiss pharmaceuticals. The Swiss pharmaceuticals became so scared they just shut down their own infrastructure. During the Battle of Seattle, the electro-hippies in the UK, while there was 50,000 people on the streets in Seattle, there was 500,000 people online. So it became a larger part of a menu for activists in terms of dealing with activism as communication, as documentation, and as a direct action online. And I'll end at this part here. Often we are asked, at least at this particular period, up to 2000 or so, especially after 9/11, what were the shifts in terms of the Patriot Act and the treatment of electronic disturbance theater. Well, we did an action against the World Trade Organization who came to New York City because of 9/11. They're usually in Davos, the World Economic Forum, I'm sorry. And so we did a virtual sit-in there, and it went extremely well. Nothing happened in terms of aggression beyond general investigation of what we did. But the most interesting, that is legal event happened around 2000, where I was invited to travel around Germany to help activists and conceptualists and artivists with the deportation class action against Lufthansa. Lufthansa during the mid to late to 2000 would use their passenger planes to move immigrants. And what happened was that they would tie them like mummies in the back seats and then put motorcycle helmets on their heads and lean them forward. Well, several of these were women and young, really young kids or young men, and it strangled them basically because they couldn't breathe and they died on board. Well, these communities wanted to stop this deportation class action, and they invited Electronic Disturbance Theater to spend a month traveling around Germany, training older activist groups like the 69 groups, conceptual artists, regular activists about what electronic civil disobedience was. And we were going to do an action against the Lufthansa website at the same time that we were going to enter into the stockholders meeting. So I traveled everywhere. One of the interesting things was that I was on a Nightline-like a German show with the vice president of Lufthansa and the head of cybersecurity for Germany. My German is not great. But midway through, the reporter turned to me and said, "Ja, Ricardo Dominguez, hacktivist. Electronic civil disobedience. Virtual or real?" I said, "Virtually real, really virtual." Ah, virtually real, really virtual. Well, they went extremely well, the action. Lufthansa said they wouldn't do it anymore. But what happened was that a young man named Thomas Vogel, who had the website libertad.de, was arrested a year later and accused of cyber terrorism and was put in a German court. And that lower court basically said that he was inciting people to commit coercion or terrorism. And so he had to pay 5,000 euro and perhaps be in jail for 10 years. We contested, of course, that. Then the First Penal Senate of the Higher Regional Court of Frankfurt overruled the initial verdict. The higher court found that online demonstration did not constitute a show of force, but was intended to influence public opinion. This new interpretation left no space for charges of coercion. The accused was found not guilty. So I thought that was an interesting component in the questions that will emerge during the second half.
I'd like to invite Chris to have a conversation about this phase of Ricardo's work. In the second part, Ricardo will be talking about his recent work with the Transborder Immigrant Tool. And as Chris is setting, I just want to thank Chris for helping us bring Ricardo here for this lecture series, for this talk. The Center for Future Civic Media co-sponsored his visit, and I may have failed to mention that at the beginning. So thank you, Chris.
So I've been asked to give 2 questions to Ricardo and engage in a dialogue that would last about 10 or 15 minutes. And then he'll talk again, and then I might ask him 1 more question or so, and then it'll be questions from the audience for over half an hour. So I'm sure you have lots of questions now. But so the Frankfurt court saying not guilty leads me to the first question, I think, which is, well, so Mario Savio, in his famous Sproul Hall Steps speech, described 2 types of civil disobedience, or whatever, in quotes. And the first, he talked about breaking a law over and over until the law is sort of becomes obvious. You know, the injustice of the law becomes obvious and it gets changed. And I think that really reminds me of the Daytona Beach, you know, performance, or the transgender drivers, or other performances like that, where you're repeatedly breaking a law to draw attention to the law. But he then, you know, described a second, you know, act, which is this act of laying yourself down on the gears of the machine, on the levers. And I think there are 2 things there that he was referring to. One is, it's not a gear or a problem, you know, in the machine that you're trying to correct. It's actually the entire machine that you're essentially trying to stop. But of course, the second point that Mario Savio was making is that you are endangering yourself by laying yourself down on the gears, because essentially it's like a meat grinder, and we've all seen Modern Times, right? So I mean, he's bringing up 2 points. One is the you finally say changing a law is not going to make a difference. It's going to have to change the system. And the second point is, and I'm willing to endanger myself to do that. And so at the very end of your talk, you talk about someone who was brought up for court, and of course, now 2 members of the Electronic Disturbance Theater have had pretty significant run-ins much after EDT, the years that you're talking about. So I guess my question to you is, do you see those as 2 important kind of discrete steps, as Savio did, or at what point in your work have you felt that it was appropriate to put your own safety or freedom on the line in order to make a protest? Or do you think that actually, I mean, you gave, for example, the difference between EDT, where it's done anonymously, and your more later work where it's done in public. Do you also see another dichotomy there around personal safety and those 2 different stages?
Well, I mean, I think it is an important question. I think what drove us to endanger ourselves, it might be a way, is to take the Gandhian disposition of when you're out in the street, it's your body, and you're protesting, and you can be arrested, you can be hurt. So grind in the machine. So the component was, well, would that be the same sort of effect-affect if we brought data bodies and real bodies together by stating in a transparent way, this is what I'm doing, this is what we're going to do, this is how we're going to do it. And so to a certain degree, I think the work participates in both vocabularies, in that it still carries the ideological kind of issue of civil disobedience. You want to break a law for a higher law, right? So there's still kind of a machine that you want to create, a better machine. But at the same time, there is this sense that by being transparent, one is willing to throw oneself deeper into the machine in a way that perhaps a higher law isn't going to justify what you're doing. So I guess we come up with a third. What if it's not a completely Gandhian disposition? What if it's not the other, right, of the grind? What if it's art, right? What if the process is of creating a simulation? Baudrillard said it was bad, right? But what if that sort of bad is a good thing in terms of art, that sort of simulation? So, and I speak of it in the film, that is that the work that we're doing is not necessarily as activist, which is a much deeper work, which is an everyday work on an issue, right? And it's not perhaps on the young Libyan rebels with guns marching, unknowing what will have you, but it's this other space in which we can't be arrested, because it's hard to arrest Hamlet. It's hard to arrest a painting. You can take it down. You can say, no Hamlet tonight, but Hamlet will be performed somewhere. Somebody will paint. So there is this other more nuanced poetics and aesthetics that is at play. And we used to call it aesthetic confusion. And I suppose one of the qualities of this is, for instance, when we did the action against the World Economic Forum, the FBI came and said, did you guys take that website down? And we said, no, art only disturbs, right? That it's an aesthetic project. You can go to the gallery here in Williamsburg, where it's being presented. It's an artwork. Now, it might have disturbed the World Economic Forum in some way, but it only disturbed it as art, because the Economic Forum has to imagine it as something other than hackers or crackers getting in or what have you. It's artists creating a work, right? And so and this happens with the FBI. They go, so this is an artwork. Yes, it's an artwork. It's in a gallery. Yes, it's in a gallery. You're not an activist. No, I'm not an activist. So it creates a different sensibility. And the hope is that there might be activists. There might be others who can take the general effect, but we work with the affect. So it's a different tension.
Well, that's actually a great segue to the next question. It's almost like I planned this because you know, I'm thinking of a scene that I really enjoyed in The Wire, where it's a cold open, the beginning of the show, and there's a bunch of kind of gangbanger-looking kids on the sidewalk dealing crack, and you watch it for a little while and you realize that they're all white, and this is, I guess, in the Polish neighborhood in Baltimore, and so it must have been season 2. Anyway, you realize that you're seeing through the binoculars of 2 African-American police people who are on top of the building looking down at them, and one of the characters just turns to the other and says, "Those thieving motherfuckers." And I guess the question to you is, we're seeing now the work that you guys did such a fantastic job of elaborating and conceptualizing and playing with in the 1980s and 90s is being created on at least 3 kind of amazing levels. And I guess the first most obvious one is that now the work that you are doing is an instrument of US State Department policy. So Hillary Clinton has given 2 large speeches on internet freedom where she extols a variety of policies for other governments, and it says that it's going to be the US State Department's job to, among other things, fund software debacles like Haystack, to provide anonymity to protesters, presumably in those Middle Eastern countries that we aren't tightly allied with. There's also Malcolm Gladwell's kind of well-known argument about weak ties and strong ties, which has led to a great kind of cottage industry of secondary articles. And then I guess most interestingly, the Department of Defense recently commissioned, I looked this up, solicitation RTB 220610, which is a virtual sock puppet system to be used at MacDill Air Force Base in Kabul, Afghanistan, and in Baghdad. So the US Department of Defense is now officially calling for private companies to develop sock puppet software to manipulate internet sites and speech thereon. Much like your move from clicking over and over on a website, they're saying that their fingers are getting tired of creating disinformation online. Could companies now develop simpler systems? So I guess those thieving motherfuckers. What are you thinking in terms of what's played out? And I guess this really came to the fore when a very sophisticated commentator on these issues, who's been doing really, really fascinating work on a listserv that we're on, recently said, "Oh, I don't know anyone who's tied this kind of stuff to civil disobedience in the Thoreauan sense." Mm-hmm. And I was thinking to myself, it's really unfortunate because 20 years ago there was a very strong connection being drawn by some very, very bright people. In a sense, the dialogue has sort of, I would almost say, hopscotched, gone over some of what you did, and it's almost being recreated again in a much broader arena. What's your sense of that transition?
Well, I mean, if you look at Ronfeld and Aquila and Cyber Wars Coming, I think it's fairly self-evident that there are these parallel issues that are at play. There's a following book called Athena's Camp, where they're planning cortical strategies, so there's always that element of research going on. But the reason that we know about these things is you have groups like Anonymous, right, who are doing virtual sit-ins, who are hacking into different corporations, who are trying to take down WikiLeaks. We were able to discover the sock puppet, or suck puppet, depending on which way you say it, because of these certain kind of hacktivist actions, right? Yeah. And certainly WikiLeaks is another element. So I think what you have is, yes, you have the emergence of a defined cyber war, an emergence of a kind of, for lack of a better word, and not to say empire-driven civic media, right? And at the same time, you have these underground groups that carry certain traditions, I think, of the earlier format. And what we have now, I think, is a larger performative matrix, right? And I think it will be always a kind of my gesture, your gesture, my gesture, your gesture, checkers or chess. But I think the difference between what these governmental bodies and corporate bodies are doing, Anonymous and WikiLeaks, all, you know, power and activists, is that art does something different. Art creates a sort of speculative realism that is always kind of doing these probes into these gaps in the languages of each of these systems.
But I've heard you talk about how the Chiapas actions actually caused Mexican government servers to no longer be able to honor requests from regular people, right? I mean, that's a very instrumental thing that you were proud of, I think, at the time. So it's not entirely a kind of a symbolic transaction, right? It's at the same time an instrumental and kind of practical transaction that you would see Anonymous or another hacktivist who didn't come from the art tradition doing.
Well, I think it would be a minor form of instrumentalism, right? A kind of minor Habermasian communicative action, as opposed to, say, what the governments or corporations are doing, what Anonymous is doing, is very much about a certain type of efficiency of technology, right? They're, to take down PayPal, that sort of thing. I don't think that the work that we're investigating is about an accelerated efficiency. I think it works at a level of a type of minor affect. And the reason it's a minor affect is that it creates a sense of tension in governments, corporations, and in groups like Anonymous, right? Because it doesn't function in those ways. And so, for instance, recently with electronic civil disobedience, my university became extremely angry because I used it against them, right? And we can deal with and it was UCOP, University of California Office of the President. He was very angry that we were supporting the students. And so they sent lawyers and an FBI to investigate the gesture. But what grew out of the gesture was that they had to recognize that this was artwork that was being developed within an art frame. Everybody is interested in presenting in museums, creating poetic gestures, and performance. Now, because the performance seems so real, right? It's sort of like Hamlet was so moving last night, right? He oh my God, they're dying. What's happening here? Doesn't mean that Hamlet is real, right? And I think the governments and the activists, for good reasons, work with this type of pragmatics and empiricism, which is part of their agendas, right? Ours is purely speculative, it's affective, it's a performance. It's called Electronic Disturbance Theater. So just because you or somebody out there feels that it's somehow instrumental or effective or whatever, is more the outcome of the gesture, of the work. And ultimately, 1 year after the Department of Defense action, we were invited by the NSA, right, to come speak to them because they wanted to know why they couldn't arrest us, right? And basically I gave a presentation, and I had Subcomandante Marcos speaking on the intergalactic network. I had Godard doing Alphaville, right? What is Alphaville? A computer, that totalitarian computer cries because of poetry. I had a DJ, and then I was telling stories of Mayan technology. And at the end they said, we don't know what the hell you're talking about. Why can we not arrest you? What the hell is Mayan technology, right? And I went, grrrr, todos a la conjunta al 23, toda la conjunta al 23, beep, 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 todos conjunta al 23. Boop. Pedrito, 2.5-year-old Tojalabal, bumped into my boot. I, the big nose, looked down and said, "Oye, Pedrito, what are you doing down there?" He said, "I'm picking up the men and women who are going to the consulta of the 23rd. Muy bien, Pedrito, but what the hell do you have in your hand there?" "It's my truck." I said, "Pedrito, be realistic. That is not a truck. It's a rock." "Well, it's not even a rock. It's a pebble." Pedrito looked up at me and said, "That is what is wrong with you Zapatistas. You have no imagination. Pipito se consulta al 21, pipito se consulta al 21. I turned to Lamar, the deepest and wisest of the Zapatistas, and said, "That's true. We Zapatistas have no imagination." To the other side of me was Don Durito, the most famous invisible bug in all the La Condon. And he looked up at me and said, "Big nose, if only you studied the proper books." I said, "Yes, Don Durito, if only we were as educated as you. I am sure the books we would read would give us an imagination." Well, we continued into the Tojalabal village. There were the men and women in consultation, deciding which woman and man would go to the consultation, when suddenly above us a commander type plane, blue and yellow, from the Mexican army flew above us. On the other side, a Mexican helicopter from the army flew around us. The sound was deafening. But in the middle was Pedrito. He looked up and said, "Ya basta, enough is enough." And zoom, he ran into his house. Zoom, he came back out faster than I've ever seen any child move. And in his hand was a stick. And he raised the stick above his head and went, "Karum, karum, 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 karum." Suddenly, the commander-type plane, blue and yellow, made a half circle, headed back toward its base. The Mexican Army helicopter slid away towards the edge of the village. Everything returned back to normal. The men, the women continued their consultation. Pedrito, satisfied with what he had done, threw the stick down, picked up his rock, his truck. Well, I, being the big nose, I walked over. I gave it a scientific viewing. Its length, its texture, smell, taste. I turned to Lamar, the deepest and wisest of the Zapatistas, and said, "It's a stick." She said, "Yes, it's a stick." Well, I, being the big nose, I put it in my pocket. We continued marching out. On the way out, we ran into Comandante Tacho. Comandante Tacho said, "Hey, big nose, what the hell do you have in your pocket there?" And I said, "This." And Lamar, the deepest and wisest of the Zapatistas, turned to Comandante Tacho and said, "It's Mayan technology." Above me was the helicopter that had drifted toward the edge of the valley. I tried to remember what Pedrito had done. Garum, 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 garum. Suddenly, the Mexican Army helicopter became a giant tin vulture. It fell straight to the ground. The clouds parted. The sun came out. Everything became like golden marzipan. Dun, dun. The NSA didn't like this story, right? So, again, I think it's different. And this is not to say that there aren't parallels, that there aren't instrumental elements at play, but they're minor in formation, right? I think at its core is this poetic, performative matrix of affects, of sensibilities, of speculations that drive these communities to either respond vociferously and angrily, or to take elements of it for their own kind of process. And I think that's what the aesthetic brings to all of this, right? That's the way it intervenes into these questions and technology. But it disidentifies, or it doesn't locate itself as we are technologically driven. We are, activists in intervention. But we're trying to suss out a different sort of frame.
Great. Okay. That's all the time for this, so we should go back to the third section of your talk.
Okay. So this is the one of the projects. I was hired in 2004. Beyond talk about Mayan technology, I don't have the appropriate qualifications other than the qualifications of being a New York artist, or you call yourself a New York artist after a while. So in 2004, I was contacted by Cal IT2, and they said, "We're interested in your work. Can you come and do a job talk? We're interested in you being in the theater department as well." I said, "Fine." And so I said, "I'm going to do a laboratory. I have never run a lab. I don't know what it looks like, but I imagine it's going to be a lab. And it's going to focus on 3 different things. One, hacktivism and electronic civil disobedience. And we'll continue to push that forward. But what is interesting for me is institutional critique. That is, I already know what happens in the outside world. What I'm interested in, what happens when you use it against the system itself. That is, the institution. Two, what I would call border disturbance art or border disturbance technologies. We're right there at the border. There's long history border art. I want to investigate what might happen there. What exactly? The other area is nanotoxicology. I'm interested in intervening in unregulated particle capitalism. I'm not really sure how that will work out, but you guys have nanotechnology labs, and you want to give them to me, right? And they said, okay, great, you got a job. I started b.a.n.g lab. Here you go. Here's your atomic force microscope. Here you go. So I started b.a.n.g lab, stands for bits, atoms, neurons, and genes. The very first day that we put our server up, we did a virtual sit-in against the Minutemen. And then we started doing virtual sit-ins with my researchers just so they could do it. I do an undergraduate class called Electronic Civil Disobedience, Theory and Practice, where I take them through all of this. And at the end of every winter quarter, we do an action against somebody so they can see how it worked out. So one of the projects that emerged out of the border disturbance art was in conversation with my longtime collaborator, really the chief technological officer. I'm more the chief disturbance officer. But he developed a tool called the virtual hiker with his wife, Paula Poole, an artist. They're both driven to go in the deep desert of the Southwest, but they don't really know how to navigate visually. They get lost just going home. So what do people who get lost going home, who have no orientation of east, west, south, but who are driven to go into the most dangerous landscapes on Earth for days, what do? They developed the virtual hiker in 2004, which is a tool, an algorithm where they say, we're going to go out, I don't know, Anza Borrego somewhere, and we want to go for 5 days. You tell us what to do. So they would wear their virtual hiker, and it would take them through dangerous territories. You know, turn here, look there. I thought that was quite interesting in terms of locative media, which I had never really been fond of, because I thought it was too urban-based, too much about narratives and stories, which is okay. I like narratives and stories, but like you would take your cell phone and it would say, this is where a murder took place, what have you, right? I thought it was interesting to dislocate that into the non-urban area. So we were sitting around in early 2007 about his project, and we started discussing, well, what would happen if we were to shift that and look at the question of the immigrants who were dying in the desert's highway, and what could we parse out of this algorithm in that direction. So that night, I went home and I wrote this thing called the Transborder Immigrant Tool project, because I noticed that the UCSD Humanities Center was offering $5,000 for transborder intervention projects. Said, this sounds like a way to get a bit of funding, right? Unlike my other colleagues in the sciences and engineering, $5,000 to us is, you know, the mother lode of going. So we were able to get money for the first part, which was to find ubiquitous, inexpensive cell phones. I'll show it to you in a moment. If you'll show see if it's a photograph right now. But we found these iMotorola 455s, very inexpensive. It had a GPS-enabled system already, really great. The midlets were very open to redesign. So we started working on it. But again, we're artists, and so we thought, well, it's okay to create a tool that might lead people in some direction, navigating. We thought water was an important issue. We knew that there were NGOs out there. So I put in for another grant that night, again, for transborder intervention, and I said, what if we were to shift global positioning systems to a global poetic system, right? That is, we want poetry in this system. That is, it's not about navigating sustenance towards just water, but sustenance of the spirit, an aesthetic substance. And so I was very lucky in that my partner, who's a professor at University of Michigan and also an experimental poet, I just turned to her in bed one day and said, hey, we got some poetry money. Would you like to write some poetry? And she said, what for? And so I gave her a general idea. And so this is what came about, and I'll just read briefly. The Transborder Immigrant Tool, TBT, is a last-mile safety device designed to lead disoriented and thirsty, regardless of their nationality, to water caches and safety sites on the U.S. side of the Mexican-U.S. border. It is intended to complement the efforts of humanitarian organizations like Border Angels and Water Station, Inc. Housed on a global positioning system, GPS-enabled platform, TBT is a production of Electronic Disturbance Theater 2.0 and b.a.n.g Lab, a collaboration among Micah Cardenas, Brett Stahlbaum, Ellie Mermad, and Dr. Amy Sarah Carroll, which performs a critical code switch on multiple registers. One, dislocating the code of locative media. It revaliances the so-called ideological neutrality of walking tools, while also decentering locative media's urban bent. Two, interrogating the language of new media, assent on the prosaic. TBT activates a conceptual poetics. 3, in the spirit of much post-1968 collective art making, it is impervious to the supposed borders between art and activism. TBT sports a user-friendly compass interface. It also includes prose poems as audio files which offer information about desert survival in multiple languages, redistributing facts comparable to those provided in basic desert survival manuals, including ones issued by the U.S. military and briefly by the Mexican government. We have presented the series of poetry interspersed with poems from a second series, more explicit in its conceptual experimentation, in various museums, galleries, performance venues. The pair functions as a single performative utterance, elongating the Mexican isthmus across the world, rhetorical as the question, what constitutes sustenance? With TBT, we seek to remaster the GPS per Laura Borrares and Juan Gutierrez reflections on global poetic system. Since 1994, just network/software art, from tactical media to hacktivism, has hidden behind the slogan, more than just art. TB is a fractal gesture that is no longer part of the histories of network art's attachment to camouflage ecologies, named by Alex Galloway and Thacker in their book, Exploit, A Theory of Networks, to an allegiance of the imperceptible or non-existence. Through TBT, we aspire to create a translucent, transparent tunnels into the electronic market as art and as something other. The post-contemporary moment demands artwork that, as gestures of visibility, can haunt the fictions of market, of the state, of the border. With TBT, we try to exceed our own expectations that art must spook the forms and contents of globalizations as network or cloud. Through and with this project, we also conspire to connect real bodies to data bodies as trans bodies, to disturb the atmospheric conditions of post 9/11 insecurities. So I'm going to show you a video. Can you show the screen, the desktop? And sound.
Heat exhaustion produces sweating, clammy skin, increased pulse and respiration rate, weakness, more fainting, nausea, and vomiting. Stop. The choices you make will dictate whether you live or die.
The whole debate about the border fence is just, it's for fools. It's for people that don't really go to these places, understand what's happening in these places, and really don't have I think, an adequate appreciation of human nature.
If you get one more, put it on top. Let's just get one more. I started a water station back in 2000. We started putting out water in the Utah Desert. And it was at the advice of a guy I met at a Wendy's.
We don't encourage nobody crossing in this side. We're just doing this because we don't want people dying out there.
And what it says on the screen right now is that there's a site direction south and that it's 3 kilometers.
If you're worried about Al-Qaeda using GPS to cross into this country, you would have to shut down NAFTA, right? Because you can go to Best Buy in Tijuana and for $59 buy a Garmin GPS, and it will give you exact directions, pure landmass. This is not going to do that. This is just going to take you to where the most recent water cache is.
I know how to get rid of the illegal aid.
I'll stop it there briefly. One of the things that I want to say is that part of the work, we might call it interactivity, is that to negotiate with other sectors like NGOs, to try to start a conversation between artistic project and what they're doing. The questions that emerge are quite interesting. For instance, I imagined that the people leaving water out in Anza Borrego in California were basically left-leaning communities. But what I discovered was that not only were they Chicano radicals like Border Angels, but they were like Water Station Inc., which were hardcore Republicans. John builds space cannons. But he's decided that it's important to leave water for a certain kind of Christian ethos that he carries. So there's an antagonism between the NGOs. And so one of the things is, how does art practice this interactivity of conversation between these groups of sustenance, which has been in itself quite interesting. The other layer is that John is the uncle of a Republican congressman who initiated an investigation with two other congressmen calling this tool a traitorous application. And they demanded that UCSD shut down the project. This built up a really strange and interesting web of, how shall I call it, of right-wing encounters, ending with Glenn Beck saying that the poetry on this system would destroy the nation. He did a half-hour show specifically about the poetry. He said the poetry would bring people to destroy the nation, to destroy the border specifically. So I always use it in my class when I speak of poetry and art, because most students go, ah. And so I say, here Glenn Beck says it's going to destroy things. Not the tool, but poetry, right? So it really developed a kind of ravenous violence around the tool. One of the outcomes was that we received a lot of email that said, we're going to kill you, we're going to kill your son, you know, we're going to hunt you down, all sorts of really vile ways. So we had to call in the Department of Justice to have a conversation about this stuff. I think like Fox Priven recently went through a lot of this sort of stuff. Also, the university started investigating us around this. It was a 10-month investigation. So one of the outcomes of this was they were looking at the original proposal from 2007, the basically $5,000 that we received for the poetry and the tool, and it took them 10 months to decide that we hadn't done anything incorrectly with the money or our proposal, but they forgot to tell us that we had been cleared. Another investigation that was started was because we did an electronic civil disobedience action against UCOP, the president of the university system. And so another investigation to detenure me started, even though they had tenured me specifically for this work. And then also the FBI started another investigation that I had violated federal laws. Because what happens is to be, for electronic civil disobedience, to be a federal violation, it has to be over $5,000. And so I was accused of disturbing UCOP for $5,600. So they started an investigation out of this. one of the outcomes of being able to stop for a moment, because we had so many lawyers and they wanted us to slow down, was that we were able to think out some of the properties of the Transborder Immigrant Tool. If you show the phone just for a moment, it's basically an iMotorola. The window is very small. I can play, it plays sound and poetry. It has Farsi, Chinese. We just got Latvian. Somebody in Latvia sent poetry. If you guys want to translate our poetry, you're welcome to it. We want as many languages since there's borders with globalization around the world. If you'll go back to the main screen. So one of the things was, the general idea was that the poetry would offer you guidance, both conceptually and in terms of how to survive. There's a lot of cactus who always point south. So if you know which cactus always points south, you know if you're going north, right? Just basic facts. Also conceptual poetry, and I'll show you, I'll play a little bit of the conceptual poetry. Hold on. This is in Farsi. So we think of it in several layers. So we wrote more poetry translated into different things. Different languages, because globalization means borderization. So basically, also it's a GPS system. It's seeking to find a single bounce. That is, we don't want people triangulated, right? So it's a single bounce that starts the database of the most recent water caches. Leads you there in a basic compass mode, tells you how far you are from it. Navigating through an arrow as well. But we also discovered that this is a really small window. And if you're thirsty, dehydrated, are you really going to pay that much attention to this window? So we thought, we looked at water dowsing as perhaps another thing to do. So you would say agua, and it would vibrate if you're headed in the right direction, as another kind of somatic architecture to play it out. The other element, of course, we discovered is these phones only last maybe about 2 hours in the hot desert. It drains battery like nobody's business. So basically, you have to turn on this phone if you're feel you're going to die. You can't use it to cross. It's like parachuting, and you have the second cord, right? It's just that second cord. But one of the things that happened was that we got more time to work on the algorithm and just go out into the Anza Borrego, work with NGOs. And one of the things Amy discovered, she did a 4-mile walk, was that the tool took her directly to the water, but there was no water there. The tool kept telling her, this is where the water is. And so we discovered you need to tell the tool, no, take me to the next water cache. So it was sort of those discoveries that the investigations brought us. The other thing was that we started finding that in Brazil, they're going through an accelerated pace of upgrading themselves because of the economy. So you can buy a lot of robust Nokias and Blackberries for absolutely nothing. And the bigger screens, the battery life is maybe an hour longer. So it gave us an opportunity to work that out. The other thing that we did was we had to prove to our lawyers, we had 7 of them, that this was artwork. They had never heard of conceptual art or Duchamp, new media, nothing of that sort. And so we were invited by the curator of the Contemporary Modern Museum in La Jolla to be part of their exhibit. And later on, we were invited by the California Biennial. The thing that really helped my lawyers was they said, we know there's a place called La Jolla, very wealthy. We know there's a museum there, and now it's being shown as art, so it must be art. And then their final question to me was, how much did you pay them? And I said, well, I don't know about the rest of the art world. Maybe they do pay to be in museums, but usually it's curators, whether we agree with them or not. They decide. So it was kind of a pedagogical moment. We're running late, so I'll stop there. Here, we're going to ask some questions.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I think
Chris back on stage.
I think I'm supposed to
or we're going to ask some questions. So.
I think I'm supposed to ask one more question, but I was downloading something from the Traitorous App Store, so okay. You know, it's interesting because you talk about the importance of art in a lot of different ways in your talk. You contrasted art that is something more than art, whereas with art that is art and something other. But you know what's also really interesting, and this has become a pretty common technique in, you know, as an artist who's been asked by the NSA to present my work, you know, it becomes a kind of a common technique that actually the viewers who you're often the most proud of, or at least who you show in your presentations, are Glenn Beck, the NSA. I mean, so you mentioned the death threats, you mentioned the NSA, you mentioned Glenn Beck. And then in terms of users, you mentioned Amy, one of your collaborators. And I guess my question is, you know, where do you see the continuum of audience, and who are the audience you're most proud of, and who, you know, who's actually heard this poetry in situ in that kind of chord scenario that you were discussing?
Well, the people who have taken on the tool and heard the poetry are the NGOs, because they're the ones that we have to work with the most intimately. And they were skeptical. They said, well, we understand this part, but why poetry?
We understand the water. But
we understand finding water.
Why the
Latvian? Why the poetry? And again, we had to go through a kind of intimate sensibility of pedagogy, right? That we are artists. We're not activists as they are. They're doing very specific work. And that our interest, again, is to dislocate what is very rapidly anchored to the project as being, it's only that, right? And again, one of the things that the UCSD investigation, they wanted to put it very much along this arc of utilitarian value. But we showed them the proposals came out at the same time. So we felt if they wanted to investigate the tool, they would have to sit with Amy, our chief poetry officer, and read the poetry with her. So there was this whole room of investigators reading the poetry out loud. And she would ask them, which poem do you like best? Which has the most resonance? And so here you had that sort of moment, right? Even with our response to like hatred, email, we decided we would use that email and flarf it and use it as a conceptual poem as well, so that we could have a dialogue with their language. So right now, the site is intimate to NGOs, the investigators, lawyers, Glenn Beck, and us, and all of you. And so the lawyers said, are we part of your performance? I said, yes.
Be careful, they'll bill you. So I think you should be choosing people from the audience who want to ask questions. Nitin, did you have a question?
No, I think I'll let the audience start. Please go. We have microphones passing around, so if you just wait for a second to get a microphone to you, because we're recording this, that'd be great.
Oh, thank you. Okay, just a couple comments. I totally appreciate what you're doing. I do have a question that I want to throw at you. I think what you're doing is really great. I'm an artist and a nurse activist, and I can prove I'm an activist because I lost my job for making an artistic film about nursing that was on YouTube. Right now I'm doing work with an interfaith group so I can go into Suffolk Prison and give medical advice because I can't work within the medical system. I'll get in trouble. And so what I do is I switch languages so that the correction officers can't understand because they're mostly Irish in Suffolk Prison, but the ICE prisoners aren't. We're visiting refugees, so I'm doing that underground. Very low tech, but I just wanted to bring it up in terms of it may be low tech, but it works. And diagnosing, giving advice. After DeChristopher got in trouble for the mining auction, I read Letter from Birmingham Jail. And so the problem is you have a lot of resources, you're well known, you can get lawyers, and I think that's a good thing, I'm not criticizing it, but a lot of people can't. And I looked at Letter from Birmingham Jail, and so imagine that Martin Luther King was in there for 10 years, and what would have happened? So under these laws, he would not have been able to be effective. So I'm wondering if you could do a spin of MLK under your model. Update it. And let's keep him out of prison. What would you do?
Oh, well, I mean, in terms of the immigrants that are being captured by the ICE right now,
yeah,
and how to process, well, I mean, one of the investigations that we're doing, and I think many people in California are doing, are following some of the radio communities in the immigrant community. Because there is a DJ, I can't remember, is a disc jockey, who basically says, ICE is coming to your town, vato, at 3 o'clock, only in Spanish, right? And so these communities then are alerted through the radio, right?
That's how Gina works.
Right, and so part of a community is trying to think out, well, can you create SMS messaging that also creates a network among those communities? And then there's a Mexican artist that will be showing at Cal IT2 Gallery this April, who's done investigation of special languages that have been created by prisoners in isolation, for long-term isolation, in Mexican prisons. And what they've done is they created a language that basically you can only see it if you hold it up to specific kind of light. And the lines then create words that are code. And they look like paintings, actually, when you go like this. But they're scratched in there. So one of the issues that he is asking is, are there ways to create comparable language methodologies that have this kind of aesthetic element of code switching? So what would happen is, for instance, we're trying to see if we can go into institutions like ICE and say, can we put up these abstract paintings, right? They're just lines and odd angles, some thick. But if the prisoner has a kind of history, then when the light hits a certain thing, a certain angle, and that's what we're trying to see, the angle, then they would get information. Telephone numbers, contact, only it would be in Spanish as a code switch. So I think there are different methodologies and different ways to process it. Now, to what degree, just because I've had this other history, I would be able to do that, I don't know. But I certainly have Cal IT2. I have institutions who are going, go out into the world, go out and help people. They go, well, I don't really help people. I'm just an artist, but I have these great drawings from Mexico. We can put them up, right? And I don't know. I mean, are those gestures that are useful?
Well, that's interesting because they do use hand signals at the window to get messages to the street, the gangs do. But the correction officers are into that. But it's interesting when you're talking because I'm thinking, well, you could put on a dance performance that included those gestures.
Well, I mean, abstract expressionism was good for the CIA in the 50s. It could be good for us at this period of time.
There's a question in the front, right here. The person in red.
Very impressive presentation. Thank you for it. I have 3 questions. I'll try and be brief with them. I'm not sure you'll answer them all. First one's a small detail. When you talked about the theater against the Department of Defense, it was mentioned that they attacked you with destructive applets, and there was no mention whether you engaged on that or not. And the question is, did you engage? If not, was that a deliberate decision? That was the first question. Second question, you mentioned that motivating factor for electronic civil disobedience, and I very much like that term, electronic civil disobedience. I think it's very communicative and accurate. Motivating factor is opposition to that which is immoral or illegal. I wished you would have been a little bit more explicit along the way as to which immoral and illegal things were motivating these various projects. I'd especially appreciate it if you could comment on that with respect to the current project. A third question, I'm not sure it's a question, is that certainly the poetry in that device strikes me as art and artistic, but the unit itself strikes me as simply a delivery vehicle and not really art or artistic or theater in any sense of the word, whether or not it may have been chosen by a curator in La Jolla to go on exhibit. And it seems to me that that's a real stretch to. It doesn't bother me that I don't consider it art. I think it's a very interesting and even worthwhile project, but I'm troubled by the stretch of calling that what to me is a technological delivery device, art. And second, related, I'm not sure if it's a question or a comment, it seems that in electronic civil disobedience, where part of that definition is to deliberately violate a law, it's not at all clear to me that there's anything illegal about this project that would make it civil disobedience in that full sense. Whether or not that delivery device would be defined as art, it seems to me that there's nothing illegal whatsoever in that entire activity. So how is that even civil disobedience?
Thank you.
The first question. They broke the Posse Comitatus law of 1878, right, because our servers are in New York City. And so when they launched their hostile Java applets, it was the equivalent of, I don't know, sending in the B-52s to people protesting at Union Square Park, or, you know. We did consider that part of the 1998 performance that we had different choices. We could pursue them and say, you broke the Posse Comitatus law. And we thought the court-driven performance might be interesting, but it would be long and durational, and perhaps there was a different gesture. And that's when we came up with the electronic disturbance kit, where we decided just to let the code go out, the HTML, as a more interesting outcome of that response to them, let it get wider. And in a certain sense, the NSA presentation is that you take the measure of power, right? You don't have to say, oh, look at the government doing this. They actually do it, and then you can look at it, frame it, study it. So that was basically the outcome. In terms of...
That was mostly question 2 that you answered. The first question was about the applets that you made.
Mm-hmm. He answered my first question completely, I thought.
Motivating factor in opposition to which is more...
so the question of higher law in electronic civil disobedience. Well, you know, one of the things about civil disobedience in general, it's really ideologically neutral. As long as you're nonviolent, you could be Nazis, you could be the communist, or, you know, you could be Glenn Beck. As long as it's nonviolent. So there's no, it's like a burrito. You can stuff it with anything, right? As long as it's nonviolent. But there is, at least in Thoreau, a notion of higher law, right? That one is trying to reconfigure what is a bad law, an immoral law, such as slavery or the expansion of the U.S. into Mexico in 1848. So in our work, we were looking at the treatment of the indigenous communities in Chiapas, Mexico, that NAFTA basically had erased, right? Took away their rights to land, their rights to education, all those things. So we saw the Zapatistas and their call for alter globalization as the higher law to go against NAFTA and its neoliberal agendas as another. So there's globalization or glocalization of the neoliberal policies, and then there's the Zapatistas' alter globalization. Doesn't deny globalization, but it's more of a peer-to-peer process as the higher law.
I think I assume that with respect to that project. I'd be interested if you would articulate the same concept for this project.
Right. Well, one of the elements of globalization is that borderization is everywhere, right? Right now, they're building walls in Turkey, they're in Israel, Palestine, US, Mexico. I mean, there's walls everywhere. And part of this is the insecurity of nation in all of this. And we can see it in the drives of the Minutemen and many others, that for individuals to cross that line is an illegal act. So they don't say immigrants, they say illegals, aliens. So it's a space that really codifies any body that moves, especially into the north, as an illegal space. So part of the higher law quality of this in terms of civil disobedience or electronic civil disobedience is that we are really looking at the question of trans. That is, that there is now a landscape in which globalization and its output of national borders is really a lower immoral law, because they are calling forth the movement of labor, the movement of community to fill the gaps in the larger globalized neoliberal structure, yet, you know, this history of denial at the same time. It's kind of a Freudian Fort da, right, back and forth. And so part of our vision is a trans condition, where we imagine that the flows of humanity across these borders is probably minute by minute the largest nation on Earth. And so they should have transborder rights, right, and to be constituted, co-equal perhaps to the commodity that has flows in NAFTA. So if a Coke can has rights and protections, so should the transborder communities have rights and protections. And so that would be our higher law. And basically, communities say anything that enables somebody to cross on them is an illegal gesture.
Why don't we let someone else ask a question?
Yeah. Go ahead. And please keep it to one question if you can, so everyone has a chance to ask.
Okay, I try to do it quick. Thanks for the brave and very beautiful poetic works. A lot of associations were running through my head. For example, the 1928 lawsuit against Brancusi, when he tried to import an artwork from Europe and custom saws as bronze, but also like the violent poetics of Santiago Sierra. I was wondering, how do you see yourself in the tradition of institutional art, and in terms of shape and form? Actually, it's very simple, because you had to make clear to the lawyers that you were making art. So, so then you kind of must relate to a certain tradition. How do you relate to this tradition? And because I wonder what kind of forms do you use as soon as your work enters the institutional space?
Well, I mean, the history of the work comes from an art practice which was named in the early 90s tactical media, that a lot of it evolved out of art practice like critical art ensemble in the 80s, which was related to group material, grand fury, which were activators, at least in the 80s for us, which were contestational, public, direct action art, if you will, agitprop. In the 90s, certainly with Thing.net, it was a type of touchstone for institutional critique, that somehow the net allowed artists no longer to participate directly with the museum or gallery, but we could critique it from the outside and create our own spaces of art on a global level. And so it touched a little bit on that sort of institutional frame, but it was very small. There was still tactical media was the predominant sort of element. What happened was that when I was hired, the job talk I gave was very specific to, I was interested in what happens to this sort of work when it's interpolated into an institution. I wasn't quite sure. And so the base that I touched was institutional critique. And the very first essay I wrote was in trying to define the work now within that sort of history. And it's something that I wasn't adequately really focused in delivering before as to where it might fall. And I'm still learning to what degree it does fit those histories, to what degree it dislocates them and moves them in another direction. So I think there are moments that touch earlier forms of institutional critique as art practice, but it's not wholly linked. as of yet. I think it probably has, this project probably has closer ties to border art and Insight, Guillermo Gomez Peña, and the Border Arts Lab community there in San Diego, and other histories in the 70s. So it probably touches on those to some degree. And at UCSD, the visual arts department that I'm a part of, with Lewis Hawk and many others, have a history of participating and defining border art. So I think those are perhaps some layers.
I think Uta had a response to that. Maybe if we can just give to Uta, Ian, and then we'll take your question, if that's okay. Yeah, it's up to you. Yeah. Yeah.
All right, sure.
Go ahead, if you can keep it.
Sure. So I'm very interested in how your work operates in public space as a kind of a public relations gesture, and how it is in effect. I mean, you haven't really talked about people actually using it, and we haven't asked you about it. As far as I know, it may not even work. So it's a symbolic gesture. It's a thing that works in press space, in media space. So I'm very interested in how the work unfolds as a public relations object, and what you do with the attention that you get, and how the discourse evolves, and how active you are in it. You touched on it a little bit, but I was wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit more about that.
Well, again, one of the things that the performative matrix, always I think it's important to have an active prop, right? It's sort of like Ibsen said, you know, if you have a gun in the first act, you must use it in the third act, right? And so the FloodNet, the virtual sit-in technology, the Transborder are active props. And what we've seen in the performative matrix is it's been introduced in the first act. It causes a certain kind of social drama. That social drama creates a series of what Grant Kester might define as dialogic or conversation pieces that go into different areas, from bars to galleries to lawyers, and I think that's an important part of the performative matrix. Now, to what degree does one control each of those elements, I think is one improvises within the context of that first act. One notices what draws into the social drama, what creates the traumatic kernel, the, oh my God, don't go there, right? Is it real? Well, it effectively is being mobilized in the first act, right? So the first act has ended with lawyers and not being able to move any further, and fears all around this active prop. The second act, I think, will be important in that the sectors of conversation with NGOs solidifying in terms of how it actually works within their sphere. Right now, we're also having great conversations with the poetry community, right? They're going, poetry. So there's another sector that was, you know, we could have said, we're going to talk to the poetry community. So now we go to a lot of poetry conferences, and they're discussing borders and activation, right? And at the same time, we're working on making sure that new platforms can work, right? From Android, what have you, can we amplify and begin to offer? And you can go to walkingtools.net and download the code and work with it and create your own work. Sans the locative element of the water. That's what you won't find. But all the code is there at walkingtools.net. So we have a pragmatic element. We have a kind of transcendental empiricism. We have a geopoetic system. And so the second act is now about to rise, right? And so what will happen when we go to Casa Emigrante, to CITAC, to CICUT in Tijuana, begin to workshop it there? That will then engender a whole series of other responses within the Mexican space about what the work does. And then, you know, the third act, I don't know, might be a gangbuster, or it might be a denouement, all right, a lovely haiku that will, you know, offer something unexpected. So while you expect a press, media, and what have you as part of the public sphere, one can't always control how that plays itself out. But one certainly is trained to expect it when one is creating socially, social drama that activates. I always go back to Aeschylus as my and this drives the lawyers crazy, right? Why Aeschylus, right? Because Aeschylus wrote the Oresteia, and the Oresteia is about a movement that we go from one form of law, the law of blood, to the law of justice, right? And that moment is traumatic. You know, basically what happens is that people, when they saw the third act of the Oresteia, it's called the Humidities, the Furies, people say the generals fainted, pregnant women gave birth, people threw up, they ran, because when the law changes to that of justice, it is a traumatic thing, right? And I think that's what really activates for me the trajectories of a third act. So imagine all of this as end of first act.
I still have a question, like, as you say, like you were hired for certain actions, you're a professor in teaching that, and we are all in a very privileged space nevertheless. I'm just curious, like, how do you think, like, we could share this privileged space with those who are actually not in that privileged space? And like, and I wanted to follow up what you just said, like, there is no public light. I mean, for example, when you were like were in trouble with like your higher administration at your university, there was an outcry. There was a lot of solidarity by many other universities, by students, by people. But most people don't have this kind of like backing up. And the question to me is still, to what does our civil disobedience really lead? Does it really change something for the people who are not in that privileged space? And I would be very curious about your experience about like the efficiency of your civil disobedience, where it really helped people, or do we just help ourselves?
You've only been here a few years at MIT and you're already saying efficiency?
I think it's crucial. To me, it is crucial.
Well, I do agree. So, I mean, in terms of, let us say, electronic civil disobedience, in terms of the first decade in the 90s as a practice, what we saw in '99 when we released the code was that we saw activists across the world for different issues using this simple HTML, right? And now it still continues. So to what degree we can say that it allowed the Zapatista community to enter into other language-scapes and social spaces. I think, at least from my communications with them, it did, right? It allowed them not only to create centers of communication and documentation, but a way to do direct action in a way that the communities there in Chiapas themselves might not have been able to do in '94. So I do think there is perhaps a 10% efficiency in the use of the tool beyond the space of the artist. This particular project, maybe there might be a 10, 15% efficiency. If we look at a project similar to this, was Brinco at Insight by the Argentinian artist Werther, I think is her name. Yeah, she did Brinco, right? And so it was very interesting to see that the language that was used in the media against that project was very similar, almost cut and paste against this project. To what degree it benefited some segment of the community crossing, it seemed to. I didn't look, I don't know what the stats were in terms of people being able to get over. It was tennis shoes that she made with maps and gave out among the immigrants. So I do think that the velocity of the work is a small percentage of, how does it change the direction of a community in whatever positive way it might play itself out.
I think that that's the promise of tactical media interventions on some level, is that, you know, that half hour of Glenn Beck, I mean, if you actually look at what that would have cost to rent Fox for that half hour, it exceeds, you know, your annual salary, which is on public record, by, you know, orders of magnitude. And I think that that, to some degree, is the efficiency of tactical media, is the idea that you have this effect that happens outside of traditional art spaces, you know, brings other people into this kind of hallucinogenic world that you're creating, you know, and does it at this tremendous efficiency in terms of the public forum and symbolism. The question is then, for much of tactical media, and, you know, my own work counts in this, does that actually have any effect past that? You know, or is the Glenn Beck diatribe, you know, still adding to Glenn Beck's kind of semiotic strength rather than actually transforming it in some way? And I think that that's, you know, the flip side of tactical media is you get the airplay, but is that airplay actually in any way transformative? Or is it just, you know, because Glenn Beck is upset about something every night, right? You know, and you know, that doesn't necessarily lead anywhere.
So we have 2 minutes on the clock. What I'm going to suggest to make this happen is that we ask 3 questions in progression very quickly, and then Ricardo can take 5 minutes or 7 minutes to answer that, so we can cluster them really quickly. So Caitlin, you can go first, and then let other people get to some questions as well, if it's okay.
Okay, so I'll try to be brief. So I guess following up a little bit on what Ute just asked was, what I'm hearing, and I apologize if this is somewhat reductive and maybe a little suspicious of what I'm hearing, you using art as in this legal context as you know, it's just art, and it's speculative. And so in that kind of logic, does that make artists have a greater realm of freedom of speech or greater rights to freedom of speech than others? And is that because art as a speculative symbolic thing has no power? Both of which I disagree with, and I think you probably do also. But using that logic, how effective is that legally, especially in a space where you know, it doesn't really matter, you know, if say in a non-U.S. context where law is not so you know, minutely defined. It doesn't really matter, whatever you were doing was wrong. And so using these tactics and tactical media and art as ways of explicitly stating the essential immorality of providing water for people. And so going out there and beyond these kind of questions of, well, it wasn't, you know, it's hiding behind this veil of art, as, you know, bringing the issue, how can those issues actually become the main focus rather than the tactic itself?
I think there was something in the, was it Mariam who had a question, or somebody next to Mariam? I can't remember. You want to go last? Okay. Is anybody else who had a question? Okay. There we go. And then we'll take Mariam at the end.
Very quickly, I notice you have never mentioned doctors. You talk about lawyers an awful lot. And when you talk about the trans-border population, healthcare, safety, physical identity is going to be very important. How do you, as an artist, an individual, self-identified, foresee identifying individuals in a global, hopefully, eventually, borderless society?
Okay. And the last one is Mariam. So we'll give you some time to think about these questions, Ricardo.
I wanted to before my question, say that I've been tweeting your talk, and I've had an inordinate amount of bots and spam while I've been tweeting you, so I've had to be like blocking all the spam. That has like never happened before. So pretty appropriate. I wanted to ask you, I guess, a more on the penultimate question about art as perhaps a speculative space, like are artists both privileged and non-effective, which I don't agree with, and I don't think that questioner did either. I was thinking of another space, and one that's perhaps very local and familiar to you in San Diego, which is the military space. And specifically, other bodies that we know of, bodies like Bradley Manning's, bodies that are confined but are not necessarily on the border, but perhaps a different legal border. And I guess this is more of an uncooked and raw question that I'm just posing, as if we think of universities and other spaces like them as privileged, which I do and don't at the same time, for various reasons of activism, but what about other institutions? Institutions like the military that would not take an artistic or perhaps more rebellious form of, I guess, transgression, like recording documents of diplomatic cables on a Lady Gaga CD, would not take that in any way lightly. And what about that? Is it just sort of like do nothing, or do what Bradley Manning did and have your personality erased? Is that what we're between? So thank you.
Thank you, Mariam. All right, you have three fascinating
okay,
questions.
See if I can remember. Too many years of drugs, so I don't know.
Caitlin was first.
So the question of is art a veil in terms of activating this work? Yeah, to no avail. Well, first of all, this is b.a.n.g Lab, and they're all artists. So there's Brett, there's Amy, Micah, and Ellie. So nobody in this group defines themselves as activists or engineers or scientists or any other than artists, right? Who are interested in performance, who are interested in technology, and are interested in activating these sorts of questions. Is it a privilege? I would think it is. I am very much in the heart of empire, and I'm in the heart of the military zone. As Mike Davies said, there are more spies in San Diego per square mile than anywhere else on the planet, right? So, and I'm often asked, am I a spy, right? And I said, I'm really a strange spy then, right? So I'm not sure. I think that as an artist, I think one has a privilege to create work in a way that moves one to process the world around one, and to find ways that open those questions in a critical way. So that's why it would be critical art. But can critical art or tactical media, even with a space of privilege, offer the kind of correctives on a larger scale to communities that will make it more than art? I'm not sure. I'm just trying to remember. Manning. Oh, no, that was it. But it was the question of using art for something else.
Sorry if it wasn't clear. I just meant the way that you were bringing up often the use of art, explaining legally. Well, it wasn't activism. It wasn't this. It was art, and it was speculative.
Other people around the world, can they do the same thing?
Well, I'm just questioning that reasoning, because isn't it? I mean, the goal of art also to open up the commons and open up the rights of everybody to speak in all these different ways. And is that going? Could that potentially, for example, backfire and then make art more of a target, or then then art becomes this kind of illegal thing, or what if your project?
But what art are you contrasting this to? I mean, Duchamp. I mean, like art has been a target for much of the 20th century in a different kind of way. What are you contrasting it to?
Oh, just the bringing it up in the legal context as a way to evade the potential illegal repercussions, rather than actually, like as the gentleman brought up earlier, claiming that as an act of civil disobedience and claiming that as an illegal act, and questioning the overall morality of the situation and those questions. So I'm just questioning the use of art as subterfuge, I guess.
Well, I don't think it is subterfuge, right? This is an art project created by artists that is defining certain textures. The texture we chose is a conceptual art gesture of electronic civil disobedience. Or what is it? How does it process it? What are its resonant points, right? Its frames, if you will. Now, one of the things that happens out of that is that communities begin to ask questions around it. Is it useful for something else? Is it legal? Is it not legal? And I think that's what you want out of an artwork, that it can't just be shut down into a kind of specific code, but we speak of it as code switching, right, or aesthetic confusion, which is something that energizes me, or else I wouldn't be here having this conversation with all of you, right? But ultimately, I suppose I want art to, you know, just create a different type of sustenance that's multi-layered. And it's a sustenance that people can take to create other core questions. And it may come to be that the third act of this is, well, you guys have broken the law. You will now go to jail or what have you. But if they do that, it will be because of art, which I think is a vital and important question. And I feel that art is often kept in the technology page or in the art page, but it's never on the front page discussing the issues of the day, but from a perspective of art. It's always the politician or the activist, or which are all good things, but it's not the artist or an artwork speaking on that. And so I think that's an important space for art to speak. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a politics of the answer, but it's a politics of the question. And I think that's the great power of it.
Just to get to the last two questions
in the
next 3 minutes.
Sorry.
Just want to make sure we can...
Doctors Without Borders? Well, one of the things is that working with the doctors at CalIT2 is they're very interested in remote telematic healthcare. And a lot of the work that's being done recently is trying to use cell phones to send data about your heart rate, taking blood, healthcare issues on a remote basis. So at least the CalIT2 kind of healthcare community is interested in kind of integrating certain kind of healthcare issues. And I mean, I'm not sure to what degree the battery life and can carry it. Somebody was just saying the sound is awful, right? How much can a phone like this do? Perhaps there might be layers as time goes by, right? That things are more robust, that the technology is able to assemble a deeper telematic healthcare, not only 911, I need help, but a care of the body, a deeper somatic architecture. I see. I see, yeah. I didn't understand that part. Yeah, it's hard to say, you know. One of the issues of identity versus singularity that's at play right now in a lot of the discourse around biopolitics and biopower. To what degree can the transborder immigrant be considered a formation of something other than identity as alien or illegal, but as a resonant global citizen? I think is certainly something to speculate. A global citizen outside of the conditions of governance and public, but the formation of a new governance and public through that trans citizenship.
Why don't we go to the next
The last question, because we have to finish
question. Let me understand the question of manning in that situation. To what degree does the work allow one to participate in expanding the voice of communities who end up, say, in institutions like the military and are shut down? That is, the privileged space of art is about allowing fearless speech, right? Rather than, I don't know, violent speech or what have you. One of the things I discovered in dealing with different bunkers, institutional bunkers, is that they're not as solid as we often imagine them. Sometimes they're very porous in terms of their class warfare, in terms of their gender warfare, in terms of their identity warfare, or what have you. I was invited to go to the Naval Intelligence College. Is that War College? I can't remember the. But it was because they wanted me to look at their games. You know, they were like intelligent game things. And I go, I'm not even a gamer. What am I doing here looking at this? But one of the things I discovered afterwards when we went to the bar was that a lot of these guys who spent all their time working on these things, highly, deep thinkers, were really angry at the officers above them because they felt the officers were sucking the ideas and upgrading themselves while they were stuck doing all the hardcore work. So there was certainly a kind of class warfare going on there. So these institutions might be porous. There might be people in the military who aren't necessarily in agreement with either the treatment of Manning or what Manning has done, and they may even be participating anonymously in doing what Manning is doing, even now. So I do think that we shouldn't see nations, corporations, institutions as these kind of whole monolithic bunkers. I think things are porous. I think there's room for interactivity between these different elements where one can discover accidental sectors of agreement towards shift and change. And I often think that the accidents that art creates in terms of promoting shifts or code switch allow this perhaps to happen in one way or another in the work that we've been trying to do and in the work that similar gestures try to do. Again, it's a politics of the question, not a politics of the answer in terms of its aesthetic formation. So man in Manning, I think, is important as a destiny of what happens to man in this kind of post-empire disassembly, the empire of disorder. And art, I think, creates an affective ordering of something other. And it's always unexpected, I think, which is just another way to say it's Mayan technology.
Or in German, Klein Manning ist illegal.
Well, I'd like to thank Ricardo and Chris for joining us today on this perfect collision of art and activism. Thank you.
Gracias.
Especially want to thank the Center for Future Civic Media for co-sponsoring this visit and to Uta Meta-Bauer for organizing and curating this series. Next week on April 4th, we will have Atiya Sorgi coming here to speak about tuning out of space, and there'll be a reception at 5:30 in the Media Complex lobby before the talk. So please join us again next week. Thank you, everyone. Good night.